Good day. And if you've just joined us, thank you very much for coming on to the session today. I'm joined here today with Mason Johnson, who works with service providers across North America and Australia to understand their endpoint management and security needs and helps them to scale their revenue via automation and orchestration. John Cassell is a fully certified member of the team as a senior solutions architect, and he guides customers through proof of concept exercises and provides post-sale support and product training. So we're here today to talk about using automation against hackers that might use it to attack your own business or the business of your customers. Before we start the session, I will remind you that we will be sending a recording out link after the session, so you can share that or watch that again. And in the meantime, if you'd like to raise any questions as we go along, you can use the Q&A facility within Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. It's going to be about 30 minutes, probably start to finish, so not too long, just a quick, short and sweet one. We're going to be looking today at automation, and as we see it, it's really a double-edged sword in the cybersecurity world. On the one hand, it helps you to streamline your operations, whether that's patching or vulnerability mediation. But on the other hand, automation tools are now freely available, and you no doubt have already seen this, where you can have ransomware as a service and so on. And so attackers are able to scale their activities and target more companies at scale now. So I'm going to hand over to Mason, who's going to be talking about how hackers and criminals use automation to their advantage, and then follow that up with some top tips on how you can improve security and reduce risk using automation. And then John will take over for a brief demo of our automation tools, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. So I'll go off now, off camera, and hand over to Mason. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Justine. And thank you everyone for spending some time with us this afternoon. The goal is really today to discuss really two sides of the same coin. One side, how are threat actors utilizing automation and the ramifications of these enhanced tactics. And then the other side, how we as service providers can use automation to combat these ever-growing threats to keep our customers' data and infrastructure secure and well maintained. So with that, let's get started. I'll go over just a few of these tactics being used in the hacking community today. That said, we have information on everything shown on the screen. So if you would like to discuss anything not covered or any that I do bring up, but in greater detail, please feel free to schedule some time with us and we can go over anything one-on-one. So the first tactic is going to be the sale of databases. Hackers are now using automation to extract and sell the most valuable data from breached databases, such as email addresses, passwords, payment card data, and other personal information, which makes this line of work more lucrative than ever before. The next is brute force attacks. Cyber criminals are using automation to perform credential stuffing and brute force attacks, which involve trying a list of stolen or commonly used passwords against multiple accounts or services. This can obviously allow them to gain access to sensitive information or resources. And then stealers and keyloggers is the next tactic. This is when cyber criminals using automation to collect and transmit the data stolen by their malware, such as keystrokes, screenshots, browser history, cookies, and credentials. They also use automation to analyze and monetize the stolen data, either by selling it on the dark web or by using it for further attacks. And then banking injects is when cyber criminals use automation to inject malicious code into legitimate banking websites or applications, which can allow them to intercept or modify the user's transactions or steal their banking credentials. They also use automation to transfer the stolen funds to their accounts or to launder them through other services. But probably the biggest concerns for service providers is the use of automation to detect vulnerabilities and to exploit unpatched devices. Cyber criminals are using automation to scan the internet for known vulnerabilities and exploit them within much smaller timeframes than before. This significantly reduces the required mean time to security resolution that organizations must consider when planning and implementing vulnerability management programs. So this brings us to the second side of the coin. Threat actors are using automation to become ever more efficient in their hacking techniques. How can we use automation to proactively prevent them from being successful when it comes to our customers? One, top of the list is to purify your tool set. And by that, we mean reduce the number of tools you have. The more you have, the more gaps you'll have. And once you've consolidated, integrate what's left. This will be a big challenge for many MSPs as it will require you to streamline your IT and security operations. Then two, getting on top of your endpoint inventory will help your automation efforts significantly. Understanding what types of users own which devices will help you create effective policies. Next, power your endpoint management with automating patching policies. And we don't mean just operating systems. A software vulnerability in an application can be just as deadly as an OS vulnerability. And four, when you're done with patching, utilize automated scanning to check for misconfigurations or policy violations. Combining these operations effectively will help you to utilize your resources more efficiently and maintain uptime for your customers. And then five, not all endpoints are equal, and neither are users or vulnerabilities for that matter. Prioritizing based on combined risk factors will help you optimize to reduce risk for your customers. And finally, 90% of patching, vulnerability scans, and vulnerability remediations consist of rinse and repeat activities. So creating workflows or playbooks to address common issues will enable you to provide predictable, proactive protection. So how can we at Syxsense help with this? By utilizing Syxsense's automation engine, Cortex, service providers are able to easily automate really all things configuration management on the endpoint. This offers enhanced monitoring and management capabilities, as well as a more advanced approach to endpoint hardening efforts. Not only can the patching process be completely automated, but also vulnerability scanning for Windows devices to detect misconfigurations, the things that can't be fixed by a patch. That said, we take it a step further and don't just leave you with the results of those vulnerability scans, but actually help to automate the remediation efforts for many of those vulnerabilities that we find. So ideally, this automation is enabling you to scale the services you are able to provide your customers and therefore your revenue and profitability. Now, let's see just how that works. I'd like to introduce John Cassell, Syxsense's Senior Solutions Architect, who will give us an overview of the Syxsense platform and our capabilities in terms of automating endpoint management and security. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Mason. That was excellent. And thank you, Justine, for the intro. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll go through a live demonstration today. Everyone should be able to see the Syxsense console or dashboard rather. Perfect. All right, thanks for the thumbs up. So we'll be looking at today, we are going to focus on automation, but there's one aspect of the solution that I do want to touch on briefly, and it was actually teased a bit on the previous slide there, looking at monitoring. Now, we'll look at both sides of the spectrum. By that, I mean proactive and then versus reactive. We'll start with reactive approach, keeping it brief. Again, we don't want to have to chase our assets all that often. We actually want to, again, put a proactive policy in place so that we can ensure that devices don't have an attack vector in the first place. Now, one thing I always mention, Syxsense is a device endpoint management solution. Now, I always tell everybody, and everyone gets a laugh out of the fact that the number one vulnerability is the end user. Bearing in mind that training, proper tools that they have access to, and adopting a proper zero trust approach, of course, ensures that what they have access to in the first place, and consider least privilege principles as well, would not be something that can be exploited. But anything is possible there. The number one thing, never give them system or administrator rights, of course, on the assets that you do give them. One other aspect before I jump into the product as well, when Mason was talking about vulnerabilities or patches rather that can be applied, the actual numbers are quite surprising. Everyone talks about operating system updates. It's actually just shy of a quarter of the number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Third-party applications and everything else under the sun, other than the operating system itself, actually accounts for roughly 75 to 80%. So it's actually a small number there. But again, we'll talk about OS and we will talk about application patching too, including policy reconfiguration. Now, when jumping into the Syxsense portal, I'm going to take us again through the reactive approach. I'm going to keep it to a bare minimum. That is, when we log in, is there something that we would want to perform on demand? The tools are here. Now, the only reason that I say this is that usually you're going to see one side of the spectrum in a solution that you've got. You either have full automation, you set and forget, move on to the next project, but then anytime that you have to rush to something, or you might want more control, you're not given those features. With Syxsense, again, you have both. We can leverage information from the dashboard to jump straight to a list of vulnerabilities that might be plaguing us or something else that we want to prioritize. One of those key factors there in going through the process of hardening our devices. Prioritization can be subjective, obviously. If we're looking at CVSS scores, if we are focusing on maybe our own internal score, maybe vendor scoring is what you're after, we want to, again, account for all of those, and every customer might use them differently. We're, of course, looking at CVEs as the top number here, looking at, of course, to NIST, to NVD, recommendations from MITRE, recommendations from CISA is where we follow suit with, but again, we can change that if we need to. If we do want to react to the situation and simply look at assets that have critical vulnerabilities, we can easily drill down to that from the dashboard, see the list of devices that have issues, and immediately kick off a task or process from here. Maybe it might be patch management, maybe it's a scan, maybe it's a remediation workflow that we'll eventually get into, but looking at a workflow designer, setting and forgetting that with an automation policy. It does start from reaction initially, but once we set that, we don't have to follow up with it. We, of course, want to just look at our results, whether it be hour after hour, day after day, month after month, how often, of course, our remediations are running. One other side of it, and looking at the data, would also be monitoring. I consider this the first level of reporting. Usually reporting, of course, is, again, reactive. We're asking a question, getting it answered. It can be proactively set, of course, but we're getting results based on another process that already took place. When we look at policies with the Syxsense monitoring solution, it's again going to break down the assets that we have and simply take a look. We keep it very simple. Do we have issues? They'll be color coded as such. Across my demonstration lab, I don't have any actual issues across services, CPU usage, free disk space, anything like that. I'm actually in the clear. So at least from what I would consider a prerequisite to hardening, there are no obvious issues with the systems themselves. Now I can be notified about this, and that's the proactive setting. If there was an issue, what would I want to do about it? As part of the policies, we can set a monitor to then open up, say, a ticket if something does actually or is considered an actual issue. That might be disk space. If we're talking about patch management alone, we have to have space to actually apply the latest updates. If the device is completely maxed out, we can't actually stack on or amend data to that OS because we don't have enough information for it, or size rather. Now, to proactively set this, again, we can look at the results, but we want to set the monitor to actually let us know, say in a ticket, in an email, or in this case with low disk space, upon an open alert where a device doesn't have enough based on our threshold, let's say 10%, we then want to open up an alert. Now, the cool thing here, I've actually already jumped into the automation designer. We're only talking about monitoring, but now we're proactively looking at a proactive policy that we want to set and no longer have to worry about it going forward. In this case, I could set an alert, which again would be the reactive approach. I instead want to throw in a disk cleanup action if the devices are running low. And this is a Windows Server policy to actually go through the system and clean up files as best as possible. This is a pre-built action according to the OS standard, but we could do other things too. If we actually want to run scripts, any language, or we actually want to go forward with, say, a registry tweak or a policy change, that could also be our choice based on an open alert. Again, this one looking at simply 10 gigs of free disk space. Now, that's what I, again, consider a prerequisite to hardening. If we're actually looking at the data, this is what Syxsense provides. Full patch listing, as well as thousands of vulnerabilities that we are going to check for, and as well for a lot of them also remediate. Now, anything that's considered a patch is fixable, 100% patchable for the updates that you see on the screen. This includes as well third-party applications, because again, that counts for a larger number than actually what OS updates are actually being exploited out there. And of course, we can see that month after month, every operating system typically pushes a large batch of updates. Windows has a set time, the second Tuesday of the month. Other manufacturers, not as much, but we have some type of cadence to rely on. Third-party app manufacturers, they can drop whenever they want. These are private organizations, public or private, but they have the choice of when they want to drop their actual updates. So we want to ensure that we do have a holistic approach to checking and verifying the latest versions. And one cool thing about the content that we offer, all operating system updates from Microsoft are pre-vetted and curated. It means you don't have to rely on WSUS and constantly chase and find that nothing's actually being patched in the long run. You set everything proactively, but actually there's no process to trigger or no process to actually control. As well as we always detect first and only deploy what's required. One other side of it, when we are talking about configuration vulnerabilities and the fact that backporting can be sometimes an issue or getting the right version, all updates are still supplied even many years back, so that we can track those differences if systems are not being updated appropriately this month or the last month or the month before that. Maybe it's a year old. We can see which updates or versions those systems are on and bring them straight to the latest. That's why we have this little shield here. It goes immediately from all these red versions that are old and obsolete directly to green. Now, one reason I'm showing this before going back to an automation policy is just to kind of provide a kind of a pre-screen looking at the content that would be feeding into that actual resolution workflow. This actually includes a lot of workflows that are going to nest within other workflows. A lot of these that are, again, scannable also include fixes as well. That could be for best practices like CIS level or CIS benchmarks level 1 and 2, DISA STIG benchmarks, and even advisories that come out from, say, Microsoft or other manufacturers, or even though you might patch the system, you didn't actually resolve the vulnerability. There might be additional checks or tweaks rather that you might have to apply to the registry or the policy on top of it, so that we actually have the settings required so that it can it can no longer be exploited. Now, advisories, those are always provided. That means that all the information that we do supply is public. It's on our main website. Feel free to take a look. We'll talk about the impact and as well the solutions offered. What can you do to solve it? One cool aspect right there at the top is that we also have workflows in the console accessible in the very first minute to then go ahead and remediate. That means we can approve these to not just a scan, but also remediate in the same exact phase. Check, execute, and check again to make sure that we no longer have an issue. Now, again, it's using the same automation designer, so we can tweak it and make changes if we need to. The beauty of it, for I believe at least 1,000 of them, I think about 1,600 of them, you'll actually be able to, so let me just close out of this, you'll actually be able to resolve. Now, where does all this pipe into? Well, one way to do it would be to create a general workflow. I've built this example in the past, so just so I can go ahead and add it again, I'm going to go ahead and delete a few of the examples I've already got here. And we're going to rebuild them, where we can basically apply all updates necessary, according to pre-detection, of course, and then apply security remediation workflows. I'll add in as well, just for an example, how we can perform prerequisites. And then one of the critical aspects of why patches don't occur, believe it or not, even to today in our findings, devices don't get reboots when they should be receiving them. That is when the patches get applied to the OS. Not so much for the application, which is great, so we can streamline the application process if the device is running, might be in use. We can check for that first. There are ways to do that, but ensuring that the system itself will go down at a certain time that the end user and administration agrees with, so that we can actually harden the asset. Now we're going to create a new workflow. There are many pre-supplied in the console, as well as all the vulnerability workflows. We're going to create one from scratch. And we're going to keep this very simple, but it is going to perform a lot at once. Just to kind of look at that example from earlier, like disk space, we'll actually use a percentage base. We'll call it islow disk space, will be our first question. Now, as mentioned, we would set a monitor on the side so we don't have to ask this throughout the actual patch process. But I just want to show how in-depth we can get with prerequisites for the actual remediation. In this case, I'm going to target Windows systems too. It's my strong suit. So I'm going to use the C volume and ask it less than 10 disk space or 10% of disk space. If it has less than 10%, then we would take that route with yes. And as shown earlier, we can execute disk cleanup as being a potential contingency, so we don't have to worry about it or react to it per se. We can clean up everything possible. We can include more too. We can get in heavily more in depth with WMI queries to get more into the registry, but I'm just going to choose all the basic options, run disk cleanup to ensure that we can take the next step. Now at this point, I have a pre-check and I have well, I'll call it a contingency. It's an option that would be if devices don't have enough, what we then want to perform. At this point, I'm going to now go ahead and run a patch deployment. Now, as mentioned, we scan first and we deploy if required. So this is ensuring that we're going to run a full scan on every patch, and if any patch is necessary, to automatically solve it. I can actually drag this into either, because what's going to happen here is we basically have an injected step in between if necessary. So if the device is not low on disk space, we go forward with a patch deploy. All that content we saw earlier is piped into here. We can make selections, exclusions. Every customer I talk to is a little different there. Do we have to worry about .NET updates? Do we want to exclude Java? We can certainly take deviations. In this general example, though, I'm just going to say everything. Now, upon success of disk cleanup, I'm also going to take the next step. I won't supply contingencies in this example, like how we would send email alerts or how we want to set the whole process to be recursive. That's a matter of our policy, which I'll show once we get through this. But if successful, and as well if disk cleanup was successful, we'll then go on to the patch run. Just after the patch run, before we get to an actual reboot, I actually want to supply all the remediations too. So I'm going to drag in my security resolve action. It's again a more large kind of action here. It's a simple action from here, but it's doing a lot at once. Hence the banner here letting me know you're going to apply a lot of changes to the system. I am going to leave it set to all as well. So upon a patch run the vulnerability scan, and as well solve anything from that library if it's seen. Even if no patches are deployed, we still want to take the next step. So I'll connect that too. One of the common questions or reasons why devices are not actually as healthy as you think is because, again, pending reboots. So we also want to assess that at the very end, is a reboot required? Now, for the sake of time, I would probably add that as, again, another prerequisite, or what I actually build out with many customers is we have a completely separate reboot policy. Within a 2-week time frame, 3 weeks, or 1 month is the typical, ensuring that devices get rebooted at least once per month, completely separate from your patch policy. That way we can track with end users and ensure that it's the proper time that they agree with, but then we get what we want as an administrator, that we can actually ensure they are getting rebooted. We kind of want to meet in the middle there with a nice balance. This will actually just be at the very end. If a reboot's necessary, we'll then go ahead and force one. So we'll ask the question. If a reboot is necessary, I'll then bubble up an interface so we can still validate with the end user. It's a very key aspect. We don't want to just forcibly reboot anything ever. I mean, I think everyone would agree with me on that. We want to bubble up an interface, allow some timers so they can defer, such as maybe 6 hours. Allow a cancel. Heck no, we don't want to allow for that. We want to defer or allow them an option to defer, but not cancel out of the entire reboot process. We'll give them a little bit more time too, maybe up to 6 hours of deferral. Now, as part of the interface and some of the text options here, since we're talking about automation, I won't dive into it heavily today, but variable management is also very important. That is that if we need to bubble up data from somewhere else in the console, somewhere else where we're collecting it, we can feed that in dynamically. Maybe as part of this interface, I actually want the device name to be listed. I don't want to type that manually, but I actually want it to be within the interface. Or maybe I want to grab information from the inventory, such as the user's name. Maybe you want to address them by their actual first name. That's possible. So this allows it to be more scalable and generalized too, such as whether we're looking at one policy to your service provider, you want to replicate it to work a little bit differently on the other. We can save this particular workflow, copy, and then generalize for the next. Just like the other one, I'm just simply going to call it apply all updates. I've typed this out before with the reboot. But again, it's applying updates and remediations, meaning that extra step, resolve it. Now, one of the last steps here to ensure that it is fully automated, we can do this in different ways. The general approach towards set and forget, let's say, if we're using that term, would be to publish a policy out of it. This is where we get to choose pretty much just 2 remaining questions: who gets it and how often. The question of how often, I'd probably choose an interval. Patching every 30 minutes, it's up to you. If we want to do it that quickly, probably say this is better as maybe a 24-hour policy or a 12-hour policy to ensure that devices are being hardened. Now, of course, once it applies once, it doesn't have to apply all that often, but it is important to scan and fill in the gaps as often as possible. So we don't want to say patch management occurs once per month, maybe twice per month. It's probably how often you'll require it, but we want to enforce it and be persistent. So if any gaps are detected, we're going to fill that gap as soon as possible. And the other side, just in case you're curious, how do we target the devices? That's all based on the way that we structure our inventory when we organize, whether it's customer by customer or group by group. All right, so that's what I've got. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, John. I did see a few questions pop in here. Let me take a quick look. So number one, and going back to Cortex, do you need any specific skills, i.e. scripting, in order to create these workflows?
Definitely not. There are options as well to use PowerShell, to use C# to get into, say, Linux scripting using Bash scripts or Ansible. Those are all optional. I word it as a low-code approach. For most, they're not going to need to know scripting. Just some general IT knowledge of understanding, general, I guess, philosophy and logic behind things, how we start and how we end, and how we can detect and take a different route is really just the only knowledge you'd want to have. Fortunately, if you don't have that knowledge either, most of the workflows are pre-built. You have plenty of samples in the console in the first minute, so you can just pick one and then work with one of the general examples.
Yep, absolutely. Typically pretty easy to use, which is great. And kind of leads into another question. Someone asked, how long does it take to install? So if you want to cover really quick agent installation for service providers, and then I can touch on the onboarding piece.
Yeah, absolutely. We are an agent-based solution across our main operating systems of Windows family, Linux, following dozens of distributions, and the Mac OS system itself. The file extension is a little bit different, but in short, it's going to follow suit with that particular operating system. The most popular one, of course, is for Windows, being a basic MSI. We can supply command line arguments too as well to specify in the pre-enrollment phase that it goes to the right container, or for a service provider, that would be your customer. So we could, of course, ensure that during that install, it falls into the right deployment in the first second that it's a part of the console.
Great. And then to touch on kind of, the onboarding piece there, it's overused, but as MSP partners, your success really is our success. So onboarding is completely unlimited. We really want you to get to know how to use the tool and feel comfortable with it to provide services to your customers. Typically, I would say people use 6 to 8 hours of onboarding. That said, we have customers that use much less, and we have customers that use well over 10 hours. So it really is whatever you need and at your pace. And then I also like to tout after onboarding, we have continuous support as well. You would have a dedicated technical account manager. So let's say 9 months after onboarding, 12 months after onboarding, you want some help building out one of these workflows or figuring out how you can do something else within the solution set. They'd be more than happy to schedule as much time as you need in order to help you build out whatever you need. So that's another great resource as well. And then just one more quick question here, John, and I know you actually looked at one earlier as far as 0 days go, but how long does it take for there to be a fix when a vulnerability is made public?
Same day, according to our advisories. So at least from a detection standpoint, it will be within the console. And if we have any additional data, according to that advisory, we will supply the fix too. It's not common that there's going to be a fix that go along with it. We usually have to wait a few days until the industry also hears that we have resolution. In most cases, that's a manufacturer patch, but if it happens to be kind of in the middle there, regarding a temporary countermeasure or workaround, if it is available, we will have it within an hour or two. Our team will pretty much stop what they're doing and provide a new remediation workflow.
Yep, absolutely. Which, as to you, is pretty powerful as far as, again, a 0 day service that you can be offering to your customers. So with that, I think that's all we had on our end. So I will thank everyone again for spending some time with us today and send it back over to Justine to close out our session.
That's great, thanks. And what a useful session. John, I think it's probably worth highlighting that every month you run a separate session on a third-party roundup. So that basically covers all the patches from the main software vendors that have been issued. And I think we're seeing, from my own view of watching those sessions, there is a little bit of spin doctoring in terms of severity and when these vulnerabilities are actually disclosed. In fact, I saw a recent story about a vulnerability that had been around for 5 whole years for a physical door security piece of software. So I guess the question is, do you think, that the key for service providers here is to enhance their services to include those third-party applications as well, not just the OS or misconfigurations?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We want to, again, a holistic approach to the OS it's not just about patching the OS issues, not just the application issues. We can kind of consider it layer by layer, but then as well reconfiguring the OS. So we can kind of consider just those top 3 right there would drastically reduce attack surface.
That's great. Great advice. So if you're interested in becoming an MSP partner, you can get your camera ready and take a shot of the QR code on the screen, or simply go to our website and fill in a form, and we'll get someone to reach out to you. If you prefer to meet with people in real life, we're on tour for pretty much the rest of the year. We've got events in Denver, Chicago, St. Louis, Salt Lake City, Houston, Raleigh, and of course we will be at RSA as well, of course. We'll be sending out a link to this session if you've watched it live, or if you're joining us from a recorded version so that you can share it with other people. That's fine. You're very welcome to do so. And in the meantime, don't forget to head to the website to see any information on those events, or to get access to future webinars and downloads. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.